What if one political decision could quietly raise the price of your next smartphone, your groceries, your car, and even your morning coffee? That's the debate surrounding Donald Trump's tariff policy right now, in the summer of 2026. And here's the strange part. This isn't even the first version of the plan. It's not the second. By some counts, it's Plan C. Twice now, Trump has rolled out a sweeping tariff program. Twice, it's run into a wall. And twice, he's found a new legal doorway to walk right back through. Courts have struck parts of it down. Trading partners have threatened to retaliate. And still, as of this week, new tariffs are landing on goods from dozens of countries, from steel to sneakers to solar panels. Depending on who you ask, this is either the most disciplined use of economic leverage in a generation or a legally shaky, economically risky bet that could cost the average family real money. But the real story is far more surprising than most headlines suggest, because this isn't just a story about taxes on imported goods. It's a story about the limits of presidential power, a Supreme Court that said, "Not so fast," and a president who essentially said, "Fine, I'll find another way." It's a story with real winners, real losers, and a Congress that's been mostly sitting on the sidelines. So stick with us, because by the end of this, you're going to understand tariffs better than most people who talk about them on cable news. Let's set the scene. Tariffs used to be one of those wonky economic terms that only showed up in textbooks and trade negotiations nobody watched. Not anymore. In the last year and a half, tariffs have touched nearly every corner of American life, and they've become one of the most contested legal and economic battles of Trump's second term. Here's why it matters to you. Specifically, tariffs aren't paid by foreign countries writing checks to the U.S. Treasury, even though that's sometimes how they get described. They're paid by American companies that import goods, and those companies often pass some or all of that added cost on to you. So when politicians argue about tariffs, they're really arguing about who ends up footing the bill and whether the long-term payoff is worth the short-term pain. By the time we're done here, you'll understand what a tariff actually is, what Trump has proposed and already put into action, why supporters think it's a bold correction to decades of bad trade policy, why critics think it's an inflation machine wearing a patriotic costume, who stands to win, who stands to lose, how the rest of the world is reacting, and what history can actually teach us about how this might play out. Let's start with the basics. Imagine you run a lemonade stand. You sell cups for $1. Then, one day, a kid 2 blocks over opens a lemonade stand too. And because his uncle owns a lemon farm, he can sell his cups for 50 cents. Suddenly, nobody's buying your lemonade. Now imagine the neighborhood association steps in and says, any lemonade sold on this street that wasn't made on this street gets a 50-cent surcharge. Now the outside kid's lemonade costs $1 too. Your stand is protected. That surcharge is, in miniature, a tariff. A tariff is simply a tax on goods coming into a country from somewhere else. If a shoe company in Vietnam wants to sell sneakers in the United States, and there's a 20% tariff on Vietnamese footwear, the American company importing those sneakers has to pay that 20% to the U.S. government before the shoes even hit the shelf. The importer usually doesn't just absorb that cost quietly. Some of it gets passed to the store. Some of it gets passed to you. Think about your favorite pizza shop. If the price of imported mozzarella suddenly jumps because of a cheese tariff, your neighborhood pizza place has 3 choices. Raise the price of a slice, shrink the portion, or eat the cost and make less profit. Multiply that by every category of goods America imports, from electronics to clothing to auto parts, and you start to see how a tariff can ripple through an entire economy without a single foreign government ever cutting a check. And that's the part that surprises people most. Tariffs are, fundamentally, a tax on the importer, which usually means a tax that lands, at least partially, on Americans. That doesn't mean tariffs are always bad policy. Sometimes protecting a domestic industry from being undercut is exactly the point. But it does mean the phrase, "China will pay for this," needs a serious asterisk next to it. Section 2. What Trump has actually proposed and done. So what's actually happening right now? Let's walk through it, because the timeline matters. Back in April of 2025, the Trump administration rolled out what it called Liberation Day tariffs. This was the big one, a near-universal baseline tariff on imports from most countries, layered with higher, country-specific rates for nations the administration said had unfair trade practices or large trade surpluses with the U.S. The legal basis for this was a law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, a statute originally designed for things like sanctioning hostile foreign governments, not for setting broad trade policy. That detail turned out to matter enormously. In February of 2026, the Supreme Court ruled, 6-3, that IEPA simply does not give the president the authority to impose tariffs like this. Writing for the majority, Chief Justice John Roberts essentially said the power to tax, and tariffs count as a tax, belongs to Congress under the Constitution, not to the president acting alone through emergency powers. It was a major defeat for the administration, and by some estimates, it put well over $100 billion in already collected tariff revenue at risk of having to be refunded. Trump's reaction was immediate and unmistakably frustrated. He called the ruling deeply disappointing and made clear, standing at the podium, that he wasn't backing down. Within hours, he was already outlining Plan B. He used a different, narrower legal authority called Section 122 of the Trade Act to reimpose a global tariff, and he actually raised the baseline from 10% to 15% as almost a show of defiance. Then came Plan C. Section 122 tariffs come with a built-in expiration date and a cap on how high they can go. So the administration turned to yet another legal tool, Section 301 investigations, the same authority used for the China trade fights back in 2018. In June of 2026, the U.S. Trade Representative proposed new tariffs of 10 to 12.5% on roughly 60 trading partners, citing concerns about forced labor in global supply chains. Those tariffs officially took effect this week. Time to land the moment the older Section 122 tariffs were set to expire. On top of that, separate national security tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper, running as high as 25 to 50% depending on the product, remain firmly in place under yet another authority, Section 232. Confusing? Absolutely. But here's the through line that connects Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C. The administration's underlying goal hasn't changed even when the legal tools have. That goal is what you might call America First trade policy. Use tariffs to shrink the trade deficit, pressure companies to build factories on American soil instead of overseas, and treat trade leverage as a tool of both economic and national security policy. The administration has even floated using tariff revenue to fund direct payments to Americans, with talk of $2,000 tariff dividend checks proposed for sometime in 2026, though that idea would need congressional approval and hasn't been enacted. So to be crystal clear about what's fact and what's still uncertain, it is a fact that multiple rounds of tariffs have been implemented, struck down in part, and replaced under new legal authorities. It is a fact that new tariffs on dozens of countries took effect this week. It is still speculation, not fact, whether those direct payment checks will actually happen. Now let's steelman the case for this approach, because millions of Americans genuinely believe in it, and the arguments aren't as simple as he just likes taxes on other countries. The first argument is about jobs. Supporters point to decades of American factories closing while production moved to countries with cheaper labor. They argue that if you make foreign goods more expensive, companies will have a financial incentive to build things here instead, bringing manufacturing jobs back to towns that lost them a generation ago. The second argument is national security. This one is less about economics and more about strategy. If the United States depends heavily on other countries, especially rivals, for things like semiconductors, steel, or critical minerals, that dependence becomes a vulnerability in a crisis. Tariffs, in this view, are a tool to rebuild domestic capacity for goods considered essential to national defense and infrastructure. The third argument is about the trade deficit.